Yo, what's up, everybody? It's Zeta, and today I'm gonna be covering a common misconception, and that common misconception is that GT is not canon, and this is false. So I'm gonna explain how Dragon Ball GT is canon, and specifically canon to the main continuity. So no, it is not some alternate timeline like people think it is, which is not true. And they've been saying this for years. GT has been canon, and Super is canon, and Daima is canon. They're all canon. So I'm gonna go address this in this video. So in 2017, the people who licensed Dragon Ball created a timeline. It shows the events from the start of Dragon Ball to the end of GT, including the events of Super. So yes, Super is part of the timeline as well as GT. Now, before anyone says it's only showing where the timelines take place and not that they're actually connected, this is false, because the timeline board only says timeline and not timelines in plural. So basically what I'm saying is there is no evidence to prove that the timeline is referring to multiple timelines and that it's only referring to one singular chronology. So GT can't be in another timeline. Not only is this timeline blatant proof that GT is canon to Dragon Ball Super, but there is actually even more supporting evidence to prove that this is the case. Toyotaro officially states that Dragon Ball Super is in fact building up to the original Dragon Ball Z ending. This would include GT, as GT is the official sequel to the end of Z, as shown in the episode preview of the end of Z, and the screenwriter Takeo Koyama confirming that GT is in fact the official sequel. Now, there are some people who think that Dragon Ball Super contradicts or retcons the ending of Z because of the statement that Bulma made about not seeing Goku in 5 years. However, this is false, as it would only be a retcon of them not seeing each other, which Super does retcon. That's like pretty obvious, but it doesn't retcon the actual ending. Super builds up to the ending by making Oob incredibly powerful as part of the story. He's literally the reason that Goku was able to beat Moro. So this is not true at all. It's only just a retcon to this Bulma statement. It's not really a retcon to the actual ending. There is also another timeline shown in the Chosenchu, which is the official Dragon Ball Encyclopedia, being the sequel to the Daizenshuu. Toriyama actually admits that the Daizenshuu staff are more reliable than him due to his memory loss and memory issues when writing the series. Toriyama himself even states that if the Daizenshuu came out a lot earlier, that it would be incredibly helpful for him to write the manga. So Toriyama actually views the people who make these guides as very reliable people of the Dragon Ball IP. And no, the Chosenchu does not cover information about the events of other timelines. The timeline guide is only in reference to one universe, so that argument does not work for the Chosenchu. Toriyama had an interview about the future of the Dragon Ball story, and in this interview, Toriyama acknowledges that GT already covers the events of the future, so he'd have to write a story in the past in order to make more Dragon Ball content. So if GT truly wasn't canon, then Toriyama would not be acknowledging that it already covers the future. Because if it never really happened, then there would be no point in Toriyama acknowledging this as a factor for his series. Here's another statement of GT being connected to the events of Battle of Gods, as Battle of Gods is placed in between, after the Buu Saga, and before the events of GT. There is an official history comic including the events of GT as part of Goku's mainline history. Now, I don't know why, but some people think that GT has to have a manga in order for it to be canon. Well, this isn't exactly true because Dragon Ball Super had an anime before its manga release, but that's not the point. GT actually has a manga, so you can't use the argument that GT doesn't have a manga, therefore it's not canon. But Zeta, it's an anime comic. It's still a manga by definition, so you kind of just have to cope and accept that. But even then, some things in Dragon Ball don't have to have a manga in order to be canon. Daima is blatant proof of this, as well as filler, and many other things that are part of the anime of Dragon Ball. There's also a common misconception that Dragon Ball GT was just made to be a cash grab to make money off of the Dragon Ball franchise, but this is not true at all. And in fact, the real reason Dragon Ball GT was actually conceptualized was because people were not satisfied with the ending, including the staff team that were working on the show, which is why they went over to Shonen Jump and interviewed Toriyama about the concept of making a new series. There's this common false argument that fans try to make where they basically argue that Toriyama didn't write GT or it's not part of his vision, so therefore it's not canon. However, this is completely false, and I'm going to explain why. And it's gotten so bad to the point where people don't think that Toriyama was involved in GT at all. For starters, Toriyama actually created the character designs of the GT characters, as well as creating the world of GT. Like, he created the backgrounds that the characters explore, like he created the other planets in the series. What's insane is that Toriyama was the one who was responsible for naming the show Dragon Ball GT in the first place. He even explains that GT means Grand Tour, which is how we know the name. The only reason Toriyama didn't write GT was because he admits that he was way too unmotivated and tired to continue the story, which is why he left it up to the anime staff. He actually then admires their work, saying that they're excellent and that he's basically happy that they pretty much did his work for him. You gotta respect Toriyama in the situation here because he actually highly respects the anime staff, while he himself has already done enough work for the series, making over hundreds upon hundreds of chapters. He's basically a perfect fit for retirement. He's made over like 300 chapters of the Dragon Ball story, and it would only be logical where if the fans wanted the series to continue, Toriyama, would give the series control over to someone else, someone that he truly respects and knows that they can take good care of their story. After all, Toriyama actually loved GT after its release, so it was a very good choice that Toriyama did because it brought a perfect conclusion to the show, in my personal opinion. I don't know if Toriyama liked the conclusion, but he likely did. Anyway, Toriyama is literally credited as the author in the GT show if you actually watch it. There's also records of Toriyama giving advice to the anime staff, so that implies that Toriyama probably wrote plot points for the series. We don't know exactly which ones, but we know that Toriyama was definitely involved, which is why the GT story is kind of the way it is, because they definitely documented advice from Toriyama and put it onto the show. Toriyama actually admired GT so much, he literally wanted to continue the story of Dragon Ball, but he was way too unmotivated, like I said before in my previous statement about Toriyama's involvement. The whole argument of Toriyama has to write the story in order for it to be canon kind of doesn't make sense in of itself, because a story can have multiple writers. Marvel Comics is notorious for this, and they have multiple different stories that are written by multiple different writers, but all of these stories are part of that character's canon. Why can't that apply to Goku or any character from Dragon Ball? Which, kind of doesn't make sense, considering that Toriyama let these people write the show for GT, and he was literally happy that they did the work for him. Spider-Man has so many famous scenes, and some of these scenes aren't even written by Stan Lee. They're not even part of Stan Lee's vision. What's even funnier is that there are things in Dragon Ball Z that weren't part of Toriyama's vision. Android 17 and 18 weren't part of Toriyama's vision as the main villains. It was meant to be people like Dr. Gero, but Toriyama's editor had made decisions that weren't originally part of Toriyama's vision. Does that mean those decisions aren't canon anymore because it wasn't part of Toriyama's vision? There are plenty of things that aren't written by Toriyama's vision. In fact, Dragon Ball Z already has more than one writer. Does that mean that's invalid now? No. What I'm trying to say is that this argument just doesn't work at all, that Toriyama has to be the one in order to write it, in order for it to be canon. A story can have multiple writers. It doesn't have to be the main one in order for it to be canon. It just has to be approved by the main writer, which which is what happened to GT and Toriyama's editor and every example of a separate writer that wasn't Toriyama. Now that I've debunked the main argument, I'll be debunking some smaller arguments that are like absolutely horrendous, and I'm just gonna throw them out the window, and I'll be debunking them, like each one of them one by one, and they are all like miserable, horrendous, and watch me embarrass these like trash ass arguments. So the first argument is that Toriyama called GT a side story, so it's not canon, and this argument is very easy to debunk. But before I get into the debunk, some of my viewers who might be watching this video may be new to debate logic. So I'm going to tell you this right now. A lot of these arguments contain a lot of fallacies, which are false arguments by definition. And I'll be explaining how all these arguments are false and what fallacies they fall under. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm going to go over to this debunk real quick. A side story isn't really a deviation from another story's timeline. Subplots aren't inherently derivative of another story's timeline, so likewise, just because GT is labeled as a side story doesn't mean it's a deviation from the main timeline of Dragon Ball. It simply means that it's a story that isn't about the events of Super while still being within the same timeline. The show GT is quite literally about ending Goku's story. It's not about a sequel to Dragon Ball Super. Although it is a sequel to Dragon Ball Super, it's not necessarily about Dragon Ball Super. It's about ending Goku's story. And besides, the show only has like 64 episodes, which is why it would kind of contextually make sense that it's a side story, considering its small size compared to OG Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z in like episode numbers. Now, this argument would kind of be jumping to conclusions because the argument is basically predictating that side story has to mean a separate timeline without proving so, and it would get rid of any other example for what a side story could be, etc., etc. So this argument is actually really false, and it's just, presupposing and predictating things that you haven't actually proved. And this is the problem with these Dragon Ball fans. They love jumping to conclusions whenever they hear something, and they never want to get, into an actual reasoning behind it. Now, look, I'm not one to stereotype Dragon Ball fans, but the moment somebody brings up GT, they are most definitely going to say it's not canon for some unjustifiable reason. Now, the next argument is that Cooler or movie characters or things related to the movies show up in GT. So GT is canon to the movies, and it wouldn't be canon to the main timeline because the movies are stated to be in alternate dimensions. However, this logic isn't actually true because Cooler is shown to be in the Daizenshuu and the Chozenshu, and the events of Cooler are actually in the main continuity. They take place after Trunks leaves and before the androids arrive. It's confirmed that Cooler is canon. Cooler is part of the main timeline. So therefore, the events of Cooler actually do happen. And no, I'm not referring to the sequel movie. Do not strawman me for the things that I'm saying about Cooler. So I do not know if the second movie is canon. It likely isn't, but the first movie most definitely is canon. He is mentioned in the Daizenshuu and the Chozenshu, which is the updated Daizenshuu. And for the next argument, people try to say that Vegeta knowing fusion would mean that GT is connected to Fusion Reborn, so it is not canon to the main continuity. However, this would be false because Vegeta would know fusion from the Broly movie, which actually is part of the main continuity, and it is an event where it did happen. So yes, he would know from the Broly movie. And also, I could just make the argument that since GT is a 5-year time skip from the end of Z, it would be enough time for Vegeta to get knowledge from his own children about the fusion dance, so it doesn't have to equate to the Fusion Reborn movie. It doesn't have to be the only conclusion. That's excluding any other possible conclusion. So I could just make that interpretation that it doesn't have to equate to the Fusion Reborn movie, and there's more evidence that Vegeta would know fusion from the main continuity rather than the movie continuity, which is, never implied to be the case. It could literally just be anything else that isn't the movie continuity, and we have more concrete evidence that it would be from the main continuity, especially with the Broly movie. And now the third argument is that Goku uses Dragon Fist, so therefore GT is connected to Wrath of the Dragon, which is not part of the main continuity. Now this argument is false because that's presupposing the Wrath of the Dragon attacks, like the Dragon Fist, has to be exclusive to a singular timeline, which this isn't true. There's no evidence to support this, and the Dragon Fist doesn't have to be exclusive to a singular timeline. It could be in multiple different timelines. Like since I already proved to you, like since I already proved to you guys that GT is part of the main timeline, right? That would just mean that Dragon Fist is part of the main timeline and the Wrath of the Dragon timeline. So these arguments are just horrible, and they don't know how to think outside the box. And Cooler's canon, so I can give them that. But Cooler's canon though, so that argument just doesn't work. They're not like it's not a new continuity at all. Alright, so the next goofball argument is that Toriyama says you don't have to agree with GT being part of the story if you don't like it. And I'm going to be debunking this pretty easily. This one's like light work. Okay, so this argument is just an appeal to belief fallacy because it's simply saying that you want to believe something is true, therefore it should be true. But the problem with this is that the production themselves view GT as part of the story, and that should be taken objectively true. In fact, the saying that you don't have to from Akira is invalidated by himself because he himself likes GT. He has given only positive feedback to GT, saying he recommends it and enjoyed watching it. So these goofballs get invalidated by Toriyama himself, and the fact that he likes GT is blatant proof that he views it as the grand final story of Dragon Ball. Alright, so this is actually my favorite argument because I know that me explaining this will definitely convert Dragon Ball Super fans into start representing GT as part of the canon timeline. And this argument is basically, if Dragon Ball GT is canon, why don't the characters use their god forms or any form that they achieved in Dragon Ball Super? This is actually explained in GT. In GT, pretty much, Goku, the wish that affected Goku, it nerfed his powers. It nerfed his ability to control his power. It nerfed his stamina. It nerfed his ability to use techniques. And pretty much this would prevent him from using shit like Super Saiyan Blue or Ultra Instinct or Super Saiyan God or anything like that. And it's not like that matters anyway because Goku literally absorbed Super Saiyan God in the base form. So Goku still has access to God Ki and the power of Super Saiyan God within him. It's just that he can't use any of the godly transformations. And it's not like that matters anyway because Super Saiyan 4 is stronger than all those forms labeled as the strongest transformation. It also does the same things like Ultra Instinct does, but way better. So it has all the perks that would make Ultra Instinct and every single other form basically irrelevant. And that is why Goku doesn't use the god forms. And for people who are like, oh, but where's Piccolo? Where's Gohan? This is actually addressed. Piccolo and Gohan did not gain any spotlight. The writers did not allow this to happen. They did not give Gohan and Piccolo spotlight because the story was more focused on Goku's story, being ended. It's also established. If you try to argue that a character not showing a transformation is essentially a contradiction to the timeline, you're basically arguing from an argument from silence. Just because a character doesn't use a transformation doesn't mean that it's not canon. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have the transformation. It's just that he just doesn't use it. Refraining from an action doesn't disprove a canonical event. And this could be for a plethora of reasons. It could be from moral considerations. It could just be that, they forgot it or something like that. I'm not saying this applies to a character, but I'm saying that this doesn't really work. This argument isn't how you form like a logical conclusion, which is why it's a horrible argument to try to debunk Dragon Ball GT's canonicity. So that's not a good argument to use like at all. And it's also setting a nirvana fallacy because that's setting realistic expectations over an idealized story. So just because the authors don't want to show a character using a transformation doesn't exactly mean that the story they made isn't canon. That's just you setting realistic standards over an idealized story created by authors that are not you. So this argument is also kind of selfish in a way. So do not use these arguments. These arguments are absolutely horrible to debunk the canonicity of GT. And you can't debunk GT because it is canon. So that's why people need to accept that immediately. You can also use the nirvana fallacy and argument from silence as a good way to debunk the, oh, why aren't characters mentioned? Oh, why don't characters show up? you can definitely use that as a way to debunk those arguments as well because they follow the same like stupid logic. But here's the problem. The problem with the whole mentioning or character showing up, that's actually addressed by the writers. It stated that the staff team was too busy working on the villains, and that was kind of becoming like a big importance within like the studio involved in making Dragon Ball GT. And also, people like to ask the question on, oh, where's Beerus? Oh, where's Whis? This is actually established in Dragon Ball Xenoverse, where if you select GT Goku against Beerus, there's actually special interactions of Beerus not knowing who GT Goku is, or like he's like, "Oh, Goku, you turned back into a kid. Did the Namekian Dragon Balls do it?" Like, Beerus doesn't know what happened to Goku, and if you make Super Saiyan 4 Goku go against Whis, Whis literally calls Goku a perfect fit for a god of destruction, which implies that Goku is literally way too strong for the training of the gods because he's quite like literally beyond Beerus at this point. There are plenty of statements for me to prove this, and I'll make this in a separate video of me scaling how strong GT actually is. So yes, this is very consistent. And before anyone says, oh, Xenoverse is not canon, Xenoverse is canon. There are plenty of statements of Toriyama being involved with Xenoverse, but I'm gonna make that, I might make that a separate video, I'm not sure. But the whole premise of Xenoverse is that it's literally all about timelines and history, and you're playing as the main timeline GT Goku, talking to the main timeline Beerus, and if you're making them talk to each other, that's what happened. It's kind of like a hypothetical what if GT Goku went back to Beerus. Although this conversation isn't exactly in the anime, it's kind of just like a what if of what happens if you send Beerus and GT Goku to talk to each other, and they literally know each other because the events literally happen. It's just that Beerus isn't on Earth anymore, and he's probably back on his planet because GT Goku and Vegeta likely also graduated from the training of Beerus and Whis, so they do not talk to each other anymore. And since Xenoverse is all about time and history, this is probably very accurate. This what if is probably very accurate to the Dragon Ball Z story, and probably explains why we do not see Beerus at all. And before anyone says, oh, Beerus could just one-shot any character from Dragon Ball GT, Beerus would be so useful against Omega Shenron or some shit like that. I've seen people say that. That is not true. Baby absolutely wipes the fucking floor with Beerus, and Beerus is not even touching Baby, and he's not touching any of the Shadow Dragons. So no, Beerus would actually be incredibly useless, and he would not even be useful to the whole premise of ending Goku's story, which is the whole premise of Dragon Ball GT, which is why there are only a handful of characters that actually contribute to what this is. And I already mentioned that the screenwriters already established why certain characters do not appear as much because of studio planning. So, yeah, in a way, Dragon Ball like media already answers these questions about super characters not showing up and stuff like that. So that is my reasoning for it. And yeah, easy debunk. For the next stupid ass argument, there's another argument that GT is only canon to the Battle of Gods movie timeline. Now, this like stupid argument doesn't work because both Battle of Gods and Dragon Ball Super are both labeled as continuations of the manga. It's just that Dragon Ball Super is more of an updated version of the Battle of Gods movie. Dragon Ball Super is an extension of the Battle of Gods movie while also retelling the events in order to extend the story. Like, they literally retcon things like Beerus' power in order to make him more of a goalpost for Goku. So no, the movie timeline is not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's just that the movies are outdated and that they've been updated within Dragon Ball Super, showing us new content that has never been seen before. So no, this argument doesn't work, and in fact, it just is an extension that builds up to the end of Z. And even the timeline in 2017 debunks it, as I showed in the beginning of the video. So do not use these arguments. You super fans cannot be using these corny ass arguments, and they are incredibly petty. But however, I will give you the benefit that I can respect people believing that GT is only canon to the movies, But however, there's no such thing as a movie timeline, so that's like a huge common misconception. Here's another argument that superfans try to make in order to prove that GT is not canon. They like to argue that the Pilaf gang is old and that in Super the Pilaf gang are younger, so GT cannot be canon because these two different characters have like two different ages. But this would just be a retcon to their ages and not the actual timeline. So this is not an argument that is good to debunk GT because I'm going to say it again. This only debunks their ages and not the actual timeline. Retcons happen all the time. Dragon Ball Super and Dragon Ball Z have retcons to their story. Now, one of the most famous arguments to debunk GT is that the Kais are still fused when in Super they are not. But this would just be a retcon to them being fused and not the actual timeline. So yes, they will be unfused in GT, or I can just make the argument that they somehow refused off screen because we don't always see them. There could have been an instance that caused them to fuse later on in the story, because Dragon Ball Super isn't exactly finished. Either way, it doesn't matter because it would just be a retcon to the fact that they are fused and not the actual timeline. So they would realistically be unfused in GT. What's even funnier is that the people that still make this logic in order to debunk GT would be admitting that Daima is not canon. And the majority of the Dragon Ball fandom actually now believes that Daima is canon based off of the information that has been given to us, which is true. I believe Daima is canon and plenty of others believe Daima is canon. But since you believe Daima is canon, you are inadvertently trying to say that Super isn't canon if you still follow this logic. Because in Battle of Gods, the Kais are still fused. And in Daima, they are not fused. So does that mean that Super isn't canon anymore because the Kais are still fused? No. This is just a retcon. This wouldn't work at all. And it's very likely that in Daima, they are going to refuse again somehow. So yeah, they're still going to refuse somehow. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but it's just a retcon to the fact that they're fused and not the actual timeline. And for people who think Daima is canon, you guys are also being incredibly hypocritical because Daima is also called a side story. Yeah, sorry, Geekdom 101, but your retarded ass argument is not going to do any justice for you because these are very hypocritical arguments that try to debunk GT, but they're fine for Daima. That doesn't work at all. And for the final debunk of this video, people try to argue that the timeline is unreliable or not valid because Pyon shows up in the timeline. However, Pyon is canon. Toriyama admits that filler is part of the Dragon Ball story, and it is not separated in any way whatsoever, blatantly saying that Dragon Ball is the anime and the manga. Pyon also shows up in Dragon Ball Z Kai, which is a show that is meant to remove the filler to give a better audience experience for the anniversary of Dragon Ball. So this is not a good argument. Pyon is in fact canon. He literally shows up in a Dragon Ball Z Kai episode. He's also mentioned in other guidebooks in the encyclopedia as a character whose events did actually happen. So you can't use the argument that Pyon disregards the timeline, which he does not. Pyon does not disregard the timeline. The timeline is still valid, and Pyon is canon, and Cooler is canon. So this argument is just, very ignorant, and it suppresses a lot of evidence that counters what they say. And people have acknowledged that filler is canon in Dragon Ball for a while now. That's why people come up with terms like anime canon and stuff like that, because filler is canon, and you can't exactly disregard that. Gregory, the little bug in King Kai's planet, yeah, he's not in the manga. He's canon only to the anime, and Pyon would also be canon. So this logic is not valid in any way whatsoever, and it's very ignorant. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. Dragon Ball GT is just as canon as Dragon Ball Super is, and super fans have been coping and cannot accept that Dragon Ball GT is canon even though the evidence is right in front of their face. Of course, I know that this is probably not all of the quote-unquote debunks to GT, but these are the main ones, and if you guys give me a bunch of Dragon Ball GT debunks, I may make a second video debunking those arguments as well, but this is mainly a debunk to cover all of the main arguments. But yeah, GT's canon, Super Saiyan 4 is like epic and stuff like that. I don't know why people don't like GT. There are great elements in GT, and that's all I have for this video. Yeah, see ya.